In my study of communist societies, I came to the conclusion that the purpose of communist propaganda was not to persuade or convince, not to inform, but to humiliate, and therefore the less it corresponded to reality, the better. When people are forced to remain silent, when they are being told the most obvious lies, or even worse, when they are forced to repeat the lies themselves, they lose once and for all their sense of probity. To assent to obvious lies is in some small way to become evil oneself. One's standing to resist anything is thus eroded and even destroyed. A society of emasculated liars is easy to control. I think if you examine political correctness, it has the same effect and is intended to. Theodore Dalrymple. Theodore Dalrymple is the pen name of Anthony Daniels. He's actually lived a pretty remarkable life. He worked in sub-Saharan Africa as a doctor and a psychiatrist, and then moved back to his home country in England and worked within the prison system and within the hospital and the National Health Service in some of the poorest areas of England. He wrote a book called Life at the Bottom, which is a series of articles that he's written over the years. I highly recommend it. What I think is interesting about his quote here is there's a lot of truth in it. All of us have been frustrated by political correctness at one point or another, and we've been frustrated not only by some of the accusations or some of the restrictions that political correctness puts on us, but also how to effectively engage with it, how to talk to somebody that is using political correctness as a substitute for a rational argument. So let's go through some examples. For instance, whenever the topic of race comes up, we all understand that this is politically correct fodder, right? Racism is a very serious accusation. It's a very serious issue, and it's something that I would hope that all people of goodwill want to oppose and want to fight against and eventually move from society. The question is how do we effectively do that? Well, defining your terms is really important, but if you look at the way that racism is being redefined, it makes it almost impossible to have a rational discussion both about what racism is and how do we effectively combat it as individuals and as a society. So for instance, the original definition of racism, the one that I think most of us associate ourselves with, is the idea that an individual would believe in the superiority or inferiority of a person based off of their race. Right? So that's a standard that could apply equally to anybody that is engaging in that sort of behavior. The new definition of racism that is being pushed is this idea that racism is not just what you think about something or what you do, it's really based off of power structures. So, for instance, if you're a racist person in the traditional sense, that you believe in the inferiority or superiority of someone based off of race, but you don't possess any sort of political or economic or social power in order to carry out those objectives, or if you as an individual have been a victim of somebody else's racism, well, you're not a racist anymore. And the problem with this idea is that there's some superficial plausibility here, which is to say that if someone has been a victim of racism and that racism has always been delivered by somebody of a different race, well then I think we would all understand why that person might be skeptical of people of that particular race. The problem comes is that when you project the evils of one person or even a group of people within a particular race onto the entire race, that's still inherently racist, even if you might have some good reasons based off of your own personal experience or victimization for believing those things. And so it's important even in that scenario to distinguish between the person that has victimized someone or victimized you because of racist tendencies and not letting that develop into own racist views of an entire group of people based off of their skin color. So the strength or the advantage within the traditional view of racism is that it is a very easy to understand objective criteria that applies to everybody. Again, the new definition says that a racist remark or a racist thought or a racist policy is really only truly racist if you have the political, social, or economic power to carry it out. And I think there's a fundamental flaw in this reasoning, and I want to illustrate that flaw by providing a thought exercise. Let's say you took a Grand Wizard in the Ku Klux Klan. Now, I think the Ku Klux Klan is an absolutely reprehensible organization. I believe that they're fundamentally racist. It's baked into their overall philosophy as an organization. But let's say that we took that Grand Wizard and we put him in a totally different place, a totally different country, where all of a sudden now he's not a part of the majority of the population. He doesn't have any political power, doesn't have any economic power, doesn't have any social power. The vast majority of the country looks differently than the way he looks, acts differently than the way he looks, believes differently than the way he looks. You could essentially say that in that moment you have erased, again, all of his potential influence within society, culture, economics, etc. Does that mean he's suddenly not a racist anymore? I would argue, of course not. He's a racist based off of what he actually believes, not just his ability or power to carry out those beliefs. Now, there is an area that I think we can find some common ground on. If you have two racists, and one racist has a great deal of power, and the other racist has very little power, then obviously one of those racists is a far greater threat to society than the other one. But that doesn't mean that their overlying philosophy is more or less racist simply based off of their ability to carry it out. And if we don't make that distinction, we run into the very serious problem of actually diminishing the term or the accusation of racism. We have to be able to have an objective criteria that we can agree on that constitutes whether or not someone is behaving in a racist fashion or not. Again, it doesn't mean that we don't include the power structure component of this. If someone has the ability to carry out their racist tendencies, they're more of a threat than somebody that doesn't have those abilities. But we need to distinguish between what racism is and then the threat, the very real threat or consequences of somebody with racist tendencies having a great deal of power in society, right? But that's the distinguishment that has to be made between the two. It doesn't, simply because you have more power, doesn't make you more racist. It just might make you more capable of carrying it out. Let's take another common term that's thrown out there today, fascist. I mean, it's amazing how you can put forward a tax policy, or you can put forward a version of society that is, would have been considered, fairly normal if you want lower tax rates, or if you think that, private companies should be able to exist and make a profit. I mean, sometimes now you'll be accused of being a fascist for that. And what's interesting is that when I ask people, define fascism, especially people that are using the term pretty frequently, what's interesting is they don't seem to understand what fascism was as an economic or as a political philosophy. And to be honest, it is somewhat hard to nail down what fascism is, but there are certain common themes. Now, the most obvious cases of fascism, and the most obvious historical examples we have of fascism would have been Nazi Germany, Mussolini's Italy, or Franco's Spain. And so let's take a look at some of the common characteristics of what fascism actually is. And again, this is important because if we're not able to define our terms, then we can't assess whether or not the accusation of someone being a fascist actually fits within a proper definition of it, or if it's just a convenient political tool to shut down debate. So fascism, as it was implemented by Hitler or Mussolini or Franco, had a couple of common characteristics. One characteristic, which is commonly put forward, is the idea of overt nationalism. And sometimes this nationalism was inherently racist, sometimes it wasn't. So for instance, in Nazi Germany, their nationalism was very racist. That wasn't quite the same story within Mussolini's Italy. So there's a distinction there. Nationalism is a component of it. It can be racist, but it's not always necessarily racist. Another component of fascism was built somewhat out of an understanding on areas where they thought socialism failed. So again, if you look at Nazi is an acronym for the National Socialist Workers' Party. Mussolini was also started off his life as a socialist as well. And it's not like either one of these people were pro-capitalist. In fact, it takes you all of 5 seconds researching Hitler or Mussolini to find out that they were vehemently anti-capitalist. So the accusation that if someone's a capitalist, they're therefore a fascist, really doesn't make any sense from a historical perspective. The way they looked at their economic policies was they would allow a private company to exist, right? That's a key component of capitalism, the private ownership of the means of production and distribution. They would allow them to exist provided that they were producing in a way that coincided with the national will. Now, what was the national will? Well, it was essentially whatever Mussolini or Hitler said it was. Now, if a company didn't operate in that way, they would then nationalize the company, which is more associated with socialism, which is the public or the government ownership of the means of production and distribution. And so one of the things that's interesting when we look at fascism is, was it a pro-capitalist system or was it more of a socialist or government-directed system? Well, again, the most prominent examples that we have clearly demonstrate that it was a government-directed system. It wasn't free markets, it wasn't Adam Smith or Ludwig von Mises. And so that distinction is important because a lot of times that term fascist is, I think, inappropriately used or somehow associated with capitalism. And part of that was also due to Marxist propaganda. One of the things that Marxists and communists did is they tried to say that fascism was inherently a right-leaning philosophy because it didn't believe in the complete government takeover of the economy. But ultimately, it still believed in the government-directed view of the economy. There was still a great deal of central planning, just like you would find in socialist and communist states. The difference is that they did allow for some private ownership, provided that they were producing in accordance with whatever the leaders of those countries decided the national will was. Some other common characteristics that you generally find with fascism was militarism. Now, what's interesting is that you also find a lot of militarism generally within socialist or communist countries as well. So it's not a distinction necessarily with what we call classical liberalism, libertarianism, or even conservatism within the American brand. To be pro-military or to support the troops is not the same as being militaristic, like you see within a fascist mindset. The other thing that you see within fascist states is there was a heavy emphasis on social welfare programs. So for instance, guaranteed retirement, guaranteed and funded state education, healthcare, all of these things were to be run essentially by the state. And they significantly limited any sort of private provision of those things. One of the things that you see within fascist states is that they essentially shut down any sort of educational alternatives that are not state-run. So the question is that these are all common characteristics of fascism. Again, whether it was in Spain, whether it was in Germany, whether it was in Italy, these are common characteristics of it. Does any of that sound like American conservatism? I mean, if you're looking at certain objectives within the American Democratic Party, and if you're looking at certain policy platform positions, whether it was high guaranteed minimum wages, whether it was unemployment insurance, okay, these are not classically liberal philosophies. These are far more in line with fascist economic policy. Now, please understand something. I'm not accusing anybody that's a Democrat or anybody that believes in certain state intervention within the economy of automatically being a fascist. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm simply saying that it is intellectually dishonest based off of the working definition we have of fascism to automatically assume that if someone is a capitalist or someone believes in constitutional limitations on government power, or they believe in more of a classically liberal or traditional view of individual liberty versus collective interest, that does not make them a fascist. In fact, that's the sort of people fascists would have rounded up and put in concentration camps. So why is it that so many people get away within our politically correct universe of assuming or making accusations that if you disagree with them, you're automatically a fascist? Well, again, this is all based off of certain philosophical concepts that allow them to debate in such a way that they can essentially ignore common characteristics and define terms in order to project their feelings onto the situation. So where does that philosophy come from? Well, some of you could go into Marxist doctrine. Marxist doctrine was obviously very atheistic, which means that they didn't believe in a set of objective moral laws in the sense that someone of a religious faith does, or even a deist, someone that believes that maybe there's a God, but it's not a personal God, they're not interactive in your life. Because there was no objective moral law without, that the rest, or from without, that the rest of us had to appeal to or had to adhere by, then objective morality was essentially determined by the proletariat or by the masses. And so they could come up with a moral structure for what was good or what was bad, not necessarily based off of objective criteria that we could all appeal to, but based off of who controlled the structures of power. And you see this sort of Marxist philosophy working its way into things like critical race theory, which obviously informs a lot of our discussions about racism. You see this sort of kind of Marxist way of viewing the world and viewing human nature and the role of the state working its way into our discussion about fascism. And a lot of this has also worked its way into academia through philosophies such as postmodernism and deconstructionism. Now, before you go to sleep, I promise I'm not going to sit here and go through a whole treatise on these things. I just want to give a quick overview, because I think it's important for us to all understand what generations of students within predominantly our academia, but to some degree our public education system, have been essentially exposed to. Postmodernism is built around the idea that there's, again, not so much an objective truth that we all appeal to using various processes to arrive at logical or rational conclusions. It's based more around this idea that you can create your own reality, or that your perspective on reality or your perspective on truth is neither superior or inferior to anybody else's. Well, obviously, this turns things like logic and the scientific method on its head in a lot of ways. Now, there's some people that would disagree with that that definition of postmodernism, but essentially that's what's being argued for, is that, again, get rid of objective truth. This is all about perspectives, which, as you can see, that has some Marxist influence in it. Deconstructionism is a little bit different, but it falls, I would argue, within the larger umbrella of postmodernism. So, on postmodernism, you're looking at philosophy in general, right? How do we arrive at conclusions, and all the different things that the biases that come into play. And again, it's not to say that all of it is garbage. It's just to say that I think the conclusions that they come to are problematic when it comes to actually trying to be able to have, coherent logical discussions. So that postmodernism is more like the overarching philosophy. Deconstructionism focuses more on language and communication. So, for instance, I'm talking to you in this podcast, and I'm speaking to you in English. And I'm assuming that if you understand English and that you're listening to it, the words that I'm saying have objective meaning. It's not that the meaning is there because I say so. It's not because the meaning is there because you heard it a certain way. It's because words have definitions, words have meanings, and those definitions apply to all of us. And we might have arguments about certain definitions. We can do all of that, but we all still agree that words have meaning. In deconstructionism, one of the central premises is that anybody that's speaking or writing in such a way is essentially trying to impose a meaning onto you, when in reality, we should view language from the perspective that it's the person hearing it that assigns the meaning to the words. Okay, now, again, there's some superficial plausibility here. Obviously, if I say something and you interpret it differently, well, then you might come to a different meaning than what I intended. And so, yes, it's important that whenever I talk to you or anybody else, that I do so in a way where I clearly define my terms so that we can both understand what we're talking about, right? That there's some sort of objective criteria that applies to both of us in the conversation. Deconstructionism kind of tears that up. It makes it to where if the listener is the one that assigns the meaning to the words, well then, okay, what's the limiting principle behind that? You can essentially assign any meaning that you want to something, and the moment I try to say, no, that's not what I mean, you then can say, well, now you're trying to impose your belief or your understanding onto me. Well, no, that's not really what's going on here. We're trying to find a clear definition within terms and words that we use so that we can have effective conversation, debate, argumentation in order to arrive at logical conclusions. But if we're going to throw that all out and say that, well, no, the listener just gets to decide what the words mean, well, depending on what you do with that, there's no way for us to effectively communicate. And so how can we now adjudicate differences or misunderstandings in a peaceful and logical manner? So if that's what postmodernism and deconstructionism essentially is, what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is more of what you see with Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas, John Locke, Montesquieu. It's the idea that we're going to look at evidence that all of us as people have the ability to use language, to use things like the scientific method, to observe reality and come to logical conclusions which are binding on both of us, right? It's not as if what I say is correct because I have more power than you. It's not that I say that what is correct is because I'm a victim and you're not, right? That's not what assigns, that's not what determines truth. But we find ourselves moving into an area of political correctness where whether or not something is considered right or wrong, true or untrue, is not based off of the amount of evidence or data that you have to back up what it is that you're saying. It's based off of your victim status. It's based off of whether or not you're considered part of an oppressor class or an oppressed class. And this has major implications for the way that we effectively communicate and adjudicate problems. Because if everything falls into this Marxian power structure or this critical race component or postmodernism or deconstructionism, then it makes it very, very difficult for us to be able to look at facts and evidence and arrive at a logical conclusion that both of us can understand as, yes, this is true, not because I said so. It's not true because you feel passionately about it. It's true because we have sufficient evidence to determine that it's true. We have a logical thought process that applies to both of us equally in order to arrive at that conclusion that now we can both work from. That's the other important portion here. It's not just working toward the truth, it's arriving at the truth so that we can work from the truth in order to achieve a better society. But if you take away the idea of objective truth, if you take away the idea of clearly defined terms which apply to both parties of the conversation, this begs the question, how do we solve problems anymore? If it's all about power structure, if it's all about oppressor versus oppressed, well then now we're going back to this idea of conquest ethic. It's not an idea of arriving at the truth that both of us can appreciate because of objective criteria beyond just our feelings. It's now about who's going to impose their will on the other. Might makes right. Your ability to impose your will, whether it be through majorities or whatever else, that is now essentially truth. And I would hope we would all reject that sort of behavior or that sort of approach to solving problems. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't ever be a time where you have to physically defend yourself. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that if we can't view society in a way where both sides of the conversation, where multiple perspectives can come to a common place where we can say, okay, as we're looking at racism, as we're looking at fascism, or as we're looking at capitalism, or as we're looking at any other issue that works its way at immigration policy, tax policy, if we can't agree on certain terms, and if we can't agree on certain approaches from both a practical and a moral perspective, if this is purely, I'm going to impose my will on you, you're going to impose your will on me, and that's based entirely on how I feel about a situation or on what my experience is with the situation, well then get ready for a whole lot of violence in society. And we've seen that. We saw it over the summer, we saw it in the Capitol on January 6th, when people come to the conclusion that there is no longer a peaceful way to adjudicate problems through logic and reasoning and understanding, and to some degree forgiveness. Well, then we go right into a might makes right society. And I hope that none of us want to live in that. So there's one other point I want to bring up because you hear this a lot. Ben Shapiro will often say, facts don't care about your feelings. And I think that's largely true. I've heard some people say that when they engage in a debate and someone starts to make an argument that is not so much based off of evidence or data about how they feel about a situation, I've heard people say, well, I don't care about your feelings. I think that's wrong, and I'm going to explain why. I do care about how someone feels about the argument that I make. That doesn't mean their feelings determine whether or not the argument is factually correct or incorrect. But it means that if I want someone to appreciate what I'm saying, then I want to be able to do it in a way that's accessible to them, that doesn't outright offend them in such a way that they're no longer willing to listen. Now, some of that is on the person that is making the argument, and some of that is on the person that's listening to the argument. If you're going to be offended by anything someone says because it doesn't correspond to what you believe or how you feel about something, well then I'm sorry, you're the unreasonable party here, and you're not someone that is willing to actually engage in debate and understanding various perspectives. But by the same token, how someone feels about a particular situation or issue or terminology might be based on experiences that they've had that are very personal to them and have had great effects on their life and the way that they view the world or they view certain terms. And taking some time to understand how someone else views a particular action or a particular piece of evidence is absolutely critical for anyone that is serious about having an honest discussion. And part of the problem that we have right now in political discourse is people don't want to have an honest discussion. They just want to be right, or they just want to be in charge, or they just want to impose their will on somebody else. And that's incredibly dangerous. So what I'm here to say is that your feelings do matter, right? Your feelings on a situation matter because those feelings are probably a result of some sort of experience that you've had or some sort of belief that you've grown up with. And I don't want to invalidate anyone's experience. But this part's critical. If you really care about helping people or arriving at a logical conclusion or arriving at the truth and being able to work from the truth in order to make society better, then your feelings are an invitation to thought. If you come to a conclusion based exclusively on how you feel about something, without actually doing the hard work of understanding why something happens the way it was and why do you feel about it the way that you do, then I would propose to you that maybe you're not driven by compassion. You're driven by this selfish desire to simply feel better about yourself in reference to a situation. And that's not good enough. I'm sorry, it just isn't. So no, the emotional reaction that you have to something is not invalidated simply because it's based off of feelings. But if you want to then take this step from feelings into understanding, eventually to an argument, and then to a solution, that is going to require a careful thought process. It's going to require logic and reason and understanding different perspectives so that you can arrive at the truth and actually improve society and elevate the debate. So I would just encourage everyone as we look at some of the political correctness that we see pervading society. And political correctness is not just a left-right dynamic. Anyone is capable of engaging in their own form of political correctness. It's an idea where you've essentially said that certain ideas or certain perspectives or certain topics are completely removed from the conversation, not because they're inherently bad, but because they don't conform with the way that you view a particular situation. That doesn't lead to honest debate. It leads to animosity, it leads to division, and eventually it leads to violence. So I just wanted to lay out that groundwork because in our next episode of Making the Argument, we're going to talk about how do we move, how do we understand the operational environment that we're in. Political correctness is there, it pervades a lot of civil discourse, it plays a lot of society, it's there present in academia, the media, Hollywood, etc. So how do we engage in a way that's effective? How do we educate our children? How do we expose them to different viewpoints in a way to where we're not just prescribing a way to think for our kids based off of our own conservative worldview, but we're actually equipping them to be able to engage in critical thinking in a way that allows them to arrive at truth, but to also do so in a way that is at least polite and courteous of other people's perspectives. Because if we can actually facilitate that sort of constructive conversation and dialogue, I believe we have the capacity to move toward a freer society where we can either peacefully agree to work together in voluntary cooperation with one another, and where we don't agree, we agree to leave each other alone to pursue happiness, meaning, and purpose without instantly running to the government and trying to impose laws or rules on someone else, or without instantly demanding that someone be fired or deplatformed simply because they said something that we disagreed with. That's the object here. So on the next Making the Argument, we're going to go through, today we laid out, we defined our terms, we talked a little bit about the operational environment that we're in. Next episode, we're going to go, how do we effectively engage? How do we prepare our kids to be able to move forward? I want to thank you for tuning into this episode of Making the Argument. Please give us a like and share on social media and the podcast that you listen to. And we look forward to seeing you next week for part 2 of this segment.